Welcome to today's story, Enjoy the Streets, Mom. A tale of power, betrayal, and redemption that will grip you from start to finish. What would you do if the people you trusted most turned your life into a living nightmare? This is not just about a family torn apart. It's about a legacy on the brink of destruction and the lengths a mother will go to save her son. Stay with us. What unfolds next will leave you questioning everything about loyalty, ambition, and love. Margaret sat in the grand living room of her family's ancestral home, gazing around with a wistful smile. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting soft, golden hues on the room's elegant furnishings. Every corner, every picture on the wall held cherished memories. Her life had been spent building a family, supporting her husband's business, and raising her only son, Richard. But now, in her old age, she found herself feeling more like a visitor in her own home. The house she had lovingly kept for decades felt strangely unfamiliar, as though its warmth had slowly faded, replaced by an icy sense of detachment. Richard, her son, approached her with a gentle smile that Margaret had always found comforting. But today, his smile seemed different, almost reluctant, as if he were about to break some difficult news. Richard was a successful businessman, known for his strategic mind and dedication to his family's legacy. Though Margaret was proud of him, she couldn't shake a feeling that his wife, Rebecca, had begun to dominate his decisions. Margaret noticed the subtle changes Rebecca had brought into the house. Luxurious but impersonal decor, her insistence on handling family matters with Richard while Margaret's opinions were pushed aside. It was as if Margaret's role had been reduced, and her heart ached with each new exclusion. Taking a seat beside his mother, Richard held her hand softly, casting a quick, nervous glance towards the hallway, where Rebecca lingered just out of sight. "Mom," he began, clearing his throat, "Rebecca and I have been talking, and we think it would be best if you took some time to rest and get specialized care." Margaret blinked, taken aback. "Specialized care?" she repeated, her heart sinking as his words settled. Richard continued with rehearsed ease. "Yes, there's a lovely care facility nearby with a private room and everything you need, care around the clock, great food. It would be good for you." Rebecca stepped into the room, her face softened by a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Margaret," she cooed, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We just want what's best for you. You've worked so hard for this family. It's time you let us take care of you for once." Rebecca's tone was sweet, but had an undertone of finality. Margaret looked from Richard to Rebecca, searching for a trace of warmth in their expressions. All she found was a mutual determination that chilled her to the bone. The word care echoed in Margaret's mind. The thought of leaving her home, of living among strangers, was overwhelming. Still, her son's gentle smile was something she couldn't turn away from. She felt a painful sense of duty to trust his judgment. Her voice quivered as she asked, "Is this really what you think is best, Richard?" He nodded, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "Yes, Mom. You'll be in the best hands, and we'll visit often." That evening, alone in her room, Margaret packed her belongings with trembling hands. She picked up a framed photograph of Richard as a young boy, smiling brightly. The ache in her chest tightened as she remembered the countless times she had comforted him through life's challenges, never thinking that one day he would send her away. "They want what's best for me," she whispered to herself, a hint of doubt flickering in her voice. She didn't dare voice her suspicions, but deep down, a sense of betrayal began to take root. As she placed her clothes in a suitcase, her eyes fell upon a small jewelry box containing heirlooms that had been passed down through generations. These were symbols of her family's history, and leaving them behind felt like losing a part of herself. Yet Rebecca had assured her that the facility would only be temporary. "Once you're stronger," she had promised, "you can come back." But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her departure from her home was something Rebecca had orchestrated for a long time. And now, for the first time, Margaret questioned how much control her son truly had over his own decisions. The next morning, Margaret found herself at the entrance of the care facility. It was a place of sterile cleanliness with long, echoing hallways and staff that smiled politely but distantly. A nurse led her to a modest room decorated in neutral tones. As she unpacked, she couldn't help but feel like a stranger in an unfamiliar world. This place, though comfortable, lacked the warmth of her home, the home where she had poured her love and life. She sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of her new reality press upon her. Over the next few days, Margaret's routines changed. Nurses came and went, checking her vitals, administering medicine, and guiding her through daily exercises. It all felt mechanical, distant. Richard and Rebecca visited occasionally, their visits brief and focused on updates about the business. Rebecca was always attentive but spoke in clipped, efficient tones, often steering the conversation back to practical matters. As time passed, Margaret noticed her son speaking less and Rebecca answering on his behalf. It was as though Rebecca had become the voice and Richard the echo. One afternoon, Margaret overheard two nurses talking just outside her room. "Did you hear? Mrs. Green got a sudden notice. Cutbacks in her family business." The words struck Margaret like a bolt of lightning. She knew that Rebecca had begun making ruthless changes to the family company, but hadn't imagined the extent of it. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Rebecca had waited for her removal to implement these changes, all under the guise of efficiency. That night, Margaret sat alone, a sense of dread gnawing at her. She thought of Richard, wondering if he saw what was happening or if he too was under Rebecca's spell. Desperation set in, and she realized that she couldn't stand by silently. She had to warn someone, anyone who might see the danger before it was too late. Summoning her courage, Margaret sat at the small desk in her room and began to write a letter to her brother, Edward, a man she hadn't seen in years. She poured her fears into words, each sentence a plea for help, a cry for someone to save her son from the clutches of his own wife. As she sealed the envelope, a surge of hope flickered within her. Edward was strong, determined, and had always been a protector. If he received this letter, maybe he could convince Richard of the truth before it was too late. The letter was her lifeline, a bridge to a family that still cared, that still remembered her value. She slipped the letter into the outgoing mail, her heart pounding. The next steps were out of her hands, but a flicker of hope kept her spirits alive. With her message dispatched, Margaret felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. Yet uncertainty gnawed at her. Would the letter reach Edward in time? Would he understand the urgency behind her words? As Margaret lay awake that night, listening to the silence around her, she knew that her next steps depended on her brother's response. And she prayed that he would see the darkness she feared was closing in around Richard. Margaret's days at the care facility quickly settled into a routine, one that felt empty and repetitive. Each morning, she awoke in a sterile room devoid of any personal touch, a far cry from the warmth of her home. The walls were a bland beige, and the only sounds were the faint murmurs of nurses in the hallway and the occasional beeping from machines in nearby rooms. Margaret tried to engage with the staff, but their smiles were always professional, never personal. She was just another resident among many, and the loneliness began to sink deeper with each passing day. Each visit from Richard and Rebecca felt like a glimmer of light, though brief and increasingly rare. They would enter her room with a rehearsed warmth, Rebecca often steering the conversation with polite updates on the family business. Margaret noticed that Richard's presence seemed increasingly passive, nodding along as Rebecca spoke for him. Whenever Margaret tried to steer the conversation toward her health or feelings, Rebecca would artfully redirect it back to business matters. She made a point of telling Margaret how well things were going under her new direction, using words like modernization and streamlining. Margaret felt uneasy, but was careful not to voice her concerns too strongly. On a particularly quiet afternoon, Margaret attempted to strike up a conversation with a nurse named Grace, one of the few who showed genuine kindness. Grace mentioned in passing how many patients felt abandoned, and Margaret's heart ached with the thought. "Doesn't anyone visit them?" she asked softly. Grace's face clouded with a look of empathy mixed with pity. "Families are busy, Mrs. Turner. Often, they think they're doing what's best, trusting that we'll take care of their loved ones." Margaret swallowed hard, her mind racing with memories of her family's empty reassurances. She had trusted Richard, yet here she was, left to feel like a burden. As the days passed, Margaret became increasingly aware of her surroundings and the quiet patterns within the facility. She noticed how many residents were also seemingly forgotten, waiting by their doors, their faces lighting up at any hint of a visitor. Some of them barely spoke, their eyes hollow, as if resigned to a life of solitude. Margaret began to recognize the faces, feeling a kinship with them, united by the silent sorrow of abandonment. She wondered if they too had been left behind by families who claimed to know what's best. Margaret's thoughts often drifted back to Rebecca's ominous updates about the business. She remembered the loyal employees, some of whom had been with the family for decades, like she herself had been. The business had been her husband's life's work, something she and Richard had once promised to protect. The way Rebecca spoke of restructuring and changes unsettled Margaret. She had a nagging suspicion that the very essence of the company was being compromised. But how could she reach Richard? Her only hope lay in the letter she had sent to her brother Edward. One evening, as she sat by her window, Margaret overheard a hushed conversation between two nurses in the hallway. "Another round of layoffs at Turner Corporation. I heard it's ruthless," one of them whispered. Margaret's heart sank. She felt a chill run down her spine, realizing that Rebecca's influence was now reaching far beyond her family's walls. She clutched her hands together, staring into the darkness outside, her thoughts racing. Rebecca's control seemed boundless, and Margaret feared what might come next if her brother didn't receive her letter soon. The days turned into weeks, and the isolation began to wear on Margaret's spirit. She found herself replaying moments from her past, trying to make sense of how everything had changed so drastically. Her mind returned to the last time Richard had visited, how distant he'd seemed, almost as if he was a stranger. She couldn't ignore the realization that Rebecca was manipulating him, keeping him under a spell of loyalty and blindness. Margaret wondered if there was anything left she could do to reach him, any way to make him see through the illusion Rebecca had cast. One afternoon, while sitting alone in the facility's garden, Margaret received a rare visitor, a social worker named Karen who was making rounds to check on residents' well-being. Sensing an opportunity, Margaret tried to open up about her suspicions and concerns for her son. But as she began speaking, she noticed a polite yet detached look on Karen's face, as if Margaret's words were simply part of a checklist to complete. "Don't worry, Mrs. Turner," Karen said with a forced smile. "I'm sure your family has your best interests at heart." Margaret's heart sank further, realizing how invisible her concerns had become to those around her. Feeling more alone than ever, Margaret began to doubt herself. Was she imagining things? Perhaps Rebecca's actions were truly for the benefit of the company, and maybe Richard's distance was just a symptom of his busy life. But deep down, a voice urged her to trust her instincts. The bond she shared with Richard was strong, and she knew him better than anyone. She couldn't believe he'd willingly stand by while Rebecca dismantled everything their family had built. Margaret held on to that hope, whispering to herself, "Edward will come. He must." As night fell, Margaret sat by her small window, gazing out at the stars and holding on to the fragile hope that her letter would reach Edward soon. She replayed her memories of her brother, his unwavering loyalty, and the strength he had always shown in times of crisis. But time was ticking, and Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was slipping away. She closed her eyes, willing herself to be patient, even as a sliver of doubt crept into her heart. Would Edward understand the urgency? And if he did, would he arrive in time to save Richard from the path he was being led down? Back at Turner Corporation, Rebecca had firmly established herself in a position of influence, quietly implementing drastic changes in the company's structure. Under the guise of revitalization, she initiated widespread layoffs, targeting loyal employees who had dedicated years to the firm. Her actions were swift and ruthless, and within weeks, the company began to lose the familiar faces that had become the backbone of its operations. She justified her decisions with terms like efficiency and modernization. But in reality, Rebecca's goal was simple: absolute control. Richard, absorbed in his own projects and blinded by his trust in her, barely noticed the rapid turnover. Rebecca's approach to company finances became equally alarming. She ordered cuts across all departments, squeezing budgets to the minimum and reducing the benefits that employees had long relied on. Her moves were designed to maximize profits in the short term, disregarding the company's long-standing commitment to its people. But the effects were felt immediately, as morale plummeted and whispers of discontent began to circulate among those who remained. Employees were growing wary, confused by the sudden shifts and feeling increasingly alienated from a company that had once valued loyalty and dedication. As Rebecca solidified her hold on the company, she used every chance to remind Richard of her commitment to his family's legacy. She would proudly present financial reports showing increased profits, glossing over the fact that these gains were built on cost-cutting measures that endangered the company's culture. Richard, reassured by the numbers she presented, praised her efforts without question. He saw Rebecca as a visionary who was carrying the family business into the future, unable to perceive the growing resentment beneath the surface. Each time she brought up hard decisions, he nodded approvingly, trusting her judgment. But outside the boardroom, Turner Corporation's reputation was taking a hit. Longtime clients noticed a decline in quality and the loss of familiar points of contact within the company. Frustration simmered among clients and vendors alike, who missed a sense of reliability that Turner Corporation had always represented. Rumors began circulating in industry circles, questioning the stability of the company under its new direction. Margaret, though isolated in the care facility, had an unsettling feeling about Rebecca's choices. She sensed that Rebecca was stripping the company of its soul, but she could only wait and hope Edward would intervene in time. Rebecca, however, was far from worried. She knew Richard was wrapped around her finger and dismissed any pushback from the remaining employees. When department heads raised concerns about the layoffs and cuts, she would cut them off with a steely gaze and a reminder of her authority. "I'm doing what's best for the company," she would say firmly, her tone leaving no room for debate. Employees who questioned her soon found themselves out of a job, dismissed with cold efficiency. Those who remained quickly learned to keep their thoughts to themselves, fearing they might be next. One evening, Rebecca returned home, feeling smugly satisfied with her control over Turner Corporation. She found Richard deep in work, oblivious to the ripples her decisions were causing. Eager to further solidify her influence, she handed him another glowing financial report, showcasing increased quarterly profits. Richard scanned it, nodding approvingly. "Rebecca, I don't know what I'd do without you," he said with genuine admiration. Rebecca's smile was careful and restrained. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," she replied, hiding the satisfaction in her voice. Yet, for all her confidence, Rebecca was aware that not everyone could be easily silenced. She recently received an anonymous letter on her desk warning her about destroying the company's foundation. She suspected it was from one of the longtime employees who'd been forced out, but she dismissed it as bitterness. Still, the letter nagged at her mind, reminding her that not everyone could be controlled. To counter any potential backlash, Rebecca began discussing plans to rebrand Turner Corporation, hoping a fresh look might distract from the internal turmoil she had caused. Richard, ever supportive, praised her vision, failing to see the manipulation at play. But some part of him wondered about the high turnover rate and the growing number of empty desks at the company. When he brought it up to Rebecca, she smoothly deflected, reassuring him that everything was under control. "Change always feels uncomfortable at first," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "But trust me, Richard, this is for the best." He nodded, willing himself to believe her, even as a faint doubt stirred in his heart. Back at the care facility, Margaret was oblivious to the specifics, but sensed a storm brewing. She hadn't heard from Richard in days, and his recent visits had been increasingly perfunctory, with Rebecca dominating the conversations. Margaret felt a deep ache, worrying that Richard's bond with her was being slowly severed. Though she trusted that Edward would arrive soon, she couldn't shake the fear that Rebecca's influence was tightening with each passing day. Every sleepless night, she spent wondering if Richard could see the trap being laid around him, and if there was any way to stop it. As she awaited Edward's response to her letter, Margaret began to feel the weight of her helplessness. She thought of her husband's dedication to Turner Corporation and the promises they had made to keep the company true to its roots. The news she overheard about layoffs and client dissatisfaction only deepened her fears. She knew Richard had always valued loyalty, and it was painful to imagine him abandoning those principles, even if unknowingly. She prayed that Edward's arrival would be the wake-up call Richard needed before things spiraled out of control. Meanwhile, Rebecca was far from done. With the financial picture looking brighter in the short term, she was eager to push even further, seeking to expand her influence both within and beyond Turner Corporation. The more control she gained, the more untouchable she felt, and she began planning her next moves with an even colder, calculated ambition. Little did she know, however, that Margaret's warning to Edward was closer to reaching him than she realized, setting the stage for a confrontation that would threaten her entire scheme. Margaret waited anxiously, her days at the care facility blurring into one another as she clung to the hope that Edward, her brother, would receive her letter soon. She had poured her heart and fears into that message, detailing everything she suspected about Rebecca's intentions and her influence over Richard. Each day that passed without a response felt heavier, and the doubt that gnawed at her began to grow. Had her letter even made it to Edward, or had something happened along the way? One afternoon, as she sat by the window, Margaret overheard two nurses whispering just outside her door. "Did you hear? That family business, Turner Corporation, I think it's called, they're laying off more people. It's strange. They were always such a stable company." Margaret's heart pounded. She leaned closer, straining to catch every word. "People are saying the new lady in charge is ruthless," one of them murmured. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling a mix of despair and anger. She was sure now that Rebecca's control over the business was tightening, with Richard either unaware or unwilling to intervene. Determined not to lose hope, Margaret tried to focus on the thought that Edward would receive her letter soon. She thought back to her childhood with her brother, how he had always been her protector, a man of integrity and strength. She knew that if anyone could open Richard's eyes to the truth, it would be Edward. But as days turned into weeks, Margaret's patience wore thin. The uncertainty gnawed at her, and the walls of the care facility felt even more confining. Every time a staff member walked by, she felt an urge to ask if any mail had come, yet she held back, fearing that they would see her desperation. Meanwhile, back at Turner Corporation, Rebecca continued her unrelenting restructuring. She was implementing new policies with increasing boldness, unafraid to remove anyone who questioned her. At the same time, she carefully maintained an image of efficiency and progress, one that she fed to Richard with cleverly crafted financial reports. She downplayed the growing unrest among employees and the discontent brewing among longtime clients. To Richard, everything looked as if the company was thriving, all thanks to his forward-thinking wife. Rebecca made sure he saw her as an indispensable asset, someone who was leading the family legacy into a prosperous future. But Rebecca's control over Turner Corporation wasn't as seamless as she thought. Rumors had started to spread beyond the company walls. Longtime clients were voicing concerns to other business partners, and whispers about unethical practices were reaching the ears of other influential figures in the industry. The brand that Margaret's family had built on trust and loyalty was beginning to erode, and even Richard could no longer ignore the tension. Late one night, he found himself lying awake, his mind filled with questions. Was this transformation truly what his father would have wanted? He tried to dismiss his doubts, reminding himself that Rebecca had only ever wanted what was best for him and the company. Then, one evening, as Richard reviewed yet another report from Rebecca, he noticed a letter addressed to him on his desk, forwarded from the care facility. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was from Margaret. Surprised, he tore open the envelope, eager to hear from his mother. But as he read the letter, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to a deep, unsettling realization. Margaret's words were filled with fear, pleading with him to open his eyes to Rebecca's true nature. She warned him that Rebecca's influence was endangering the very core of their family, and that her own confinement to the facility had been part of Rebecca's scheme to keep her away. Richard's mind raced as he finished reading the letter. Could it be possible? His mother had never been one to make baseless accusations, and the passion in her words was clear. Yet, he struggled to reconcile the image of the woman he loved with the person his mother described. Had he been so blind? He wanted to brush it off as paranoia, but the tone of Margaret's letter gnawed at him, refusing to let him rest. He folded the letter carefully, slipping it into his jacket pocket, determined to talk to Rebecca about it, but also feeling a rising need for caution. The following day, Richard attempted to bring up the letter with Rebecca. "I got a letter from my mother," he started, watching her reaction closely. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly, but she quickly recovered, adopting a concerned expression. "Oh, what did she say?" she asked, her tone light but tense. Richard hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She seems unsettled. She's worried about some of the changes in the company. She feels you might be pushing things too hard." Rebecca's gaze hardened for a brief moment, then softened as she let out a practiced sigh. "Richard, your mother is just confused. She's not used to these kinds of changes, and it's normal for her to feel uncomfortable. But trust me, everything I'm doing is for the company and for you." Despite her reassurances, a sliver of doubt lingered in Richard's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that his mother's words held some truth, even if he didn't want to believe it. That night, he found himself going over past conversations with Rebecca, replaying moments where she had subtly guided his decisions or dismissed his concerns. Pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, yet he still felt trapped in the web of loyalty he had built with his wife. Who was telling the truth, his mother, who had always been his confidant, or Rebecca, who claimed to have the company's best interests at heart? As he lay awake, wrestling with his thoughts, a knock at the door jolted him. He opened it to find Edward standing there, his face etched with concern. "Richard," he said, his voice firm yet empathetic. "We need to talk." Edward had never expected to return to the Turner family home under such circumstances. Margaret's letter had disturbed him deeply, stirring an urgency he hadn't felt in years. The last time he had visited, Richard had been just a young boy, wide-eyed and curious about the world. Now, Edward stood at the doorstep, a serious expression on his face, prepared to confront a reality he had hoped was only an exaggeration. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. Rebecca is capable of anything. As he waited for someone to answer the door, Edward felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and sadness. This had once been a place filled with warmth, a haven for family gatherings and shared memories. But as the door swung open, he was greeted not by Richard, but by Rebecca. Her smile was polite, but her eyes held an edge of suspicion. "Edward," she said, her voice smooth and controlled. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting you." She extended her hand with a practiced grace, though her gaze never softened. "Rebecca," Edward replied, his tone neutral but firm. "I came to see my nephew and check on Margaret." He kept his words measured, sensing that Rebecca was already on high alert. She raised an eyebrow, her smile tightening slightly. "Margaret is being well taken care of at the facility. Richard and I make sure she has everything she needs," she replied coolly. Edward could feel the tension thickening between them. He didn't trust her for a second, and he suspected she could sense it. "I'd like to speak with Richard," he said simply, holding her gaze. Rebecca hesitated, her calm demeanor faltering for just a moment. "Of course," she said finally, gesturing for him to enter. As she led him through the house, Edward observed the changes: lavish decorations, expensive art pieces, and a coldness that seemed to permeate the walls. This was no longer the home he remembered, filled with family heirlooms and memories. It had become something different, a reflection of Rebecca's influence. She directed him to Richard's study, giving a last, guarded glance before leaving them alone. Richard stood up as Edward entered, a look of surprise and mild confusion on his face. "Uncle Edward," he greeted warmly, though a shadow of tension flickered in his eyes. Edward embraced him briefly, noting how weary Richard seemed. "I came as soon as I could, Richard," Edward began, his tone steady. "I received a letter from your mother, and she's worried. Very worried, in fact. She believes things are not as they should be, both with her care and with the company." Richard's expression shifted, and he looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "Uncle Edward, I know my mother can be dramatic," Richard replied, his voice hesitant. "Rebecca and I thought it would be best for her to stay somewhere she could get the right care. You know how hard it's been for her." Edward listened, noticing the uncertainty in Richard's words. "Richard," he said gently, "your mother doesn't feel like she's receiving care. She feels like she's been removed from her life, from everything she's built, and from the company she helped your father run. And she's worried about Rebecca's control over both you and Turner Corporation." Richard shifted uneasily in his seat, struggling with his loyalty to both his mother and his wife. "Rebecca has done a lot to help me with the company," he defended, though his voice lacked conviction. "She's making tough decisions, but she's doing it to keep things moving forward." Edward nodded slowly, sensing Richard's inner conflict. "I understand, Richard, but ask yourself, are these decisions what your mother, or even your father, would have wanted? Turner Corporation wasn't built on ruthless cutbacks or abandoning loyal employees. It was built on trust, on relationships." The words seemed to strike a chord in Richard. He looked down, as if seeing the doubt he'd been avoiding. Edward continued, his tone softening. "Your mother feels isolated, Richard. She thinks that Rebecca is slowly taking control, not just of the company, but of you as well." Richard's eyes flashed with something, anger or maybe fear, and he took a deep breath. "I don't know, Uncle," he murmured, rubbing his temples. "It's hard to tell anymore. Sometimes I do feel like I'm not the one in control." Just then, a faint knock interrupted their conversation, and the door opened to reveal Rebecca standing in the doorway, her face composed but her gaze sharp. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her tone filled with feigned innocence. Edward observed her carefully, choosing his words with precision. "Yes, we're just having a family discussion," he replied with a calmness that belied his suspicion. Rebecca's eyes flicked between them, and for a brief moment, Edward saw a flash of something darker in her expression, annoyance, perhaps even fear. "Richard," she said, her voice warm yet insistent, "we have a meeting to prepare for, remember? Perhaps we can catch up with Edward later." Her tone was sweet, but there was an unmistakable firmness beneath it. Edward watched as Richard's face hardened slightly, caught between his wife's expectations and his own lingering doubts. Rebecca's influence was palpable, and Edward knew it would take more than a single conversation to break through. Edward stood, sensing that he had pushed as far as he could for now. "Of course. I'll be here for a few days," he said, giving Richard a pointed look. "We can continue our conversation when you have more time." Richard nodded, though he avoided meeting Edward's gaze, his unease clear. Rebecca offered Edward a courteous but chilly smile. "We'll catch up soon," she promised, her words laced with an unspoken warning. As Edward left the study, he could feel Rebecca's eyes on him, watching his every move. He was certain now that Margaret's concerns were valid, and he knew he would have to act carefully if he was going to protect his family from whatever Rebecca had planned. Later that evening, Edward sat alone in his hotel room, contemplating his next steps. He thought of Margaret, confined to a sterile room, worrying about her son. He thought of Richard, trapped in a web spun by someone he trusted. And he thought of Rebecca, her seemingly flawless demeanor hiding something far darker. Margaret had been right. Rebecca's influence had taken root deep within the family, and Richard was too entangled to see it clearly. Edward knew he needed to find a way to make his nephew see the truth, but he also realized that confronting Rebecca directly would be risky. If she sensed his intentions, there was no telling what she might do to maintain her control. As Edward sat in the quiet of his room, a plan began to form. He would need allies, he would need patience, and most of all, he would need to tread carefully. The game was only beginning, and he was determined not to let Margaret down. Before he turned out the lights, Edward glanced at the letter from his sister once more, reading her words one last time. "They need you, Edward. He need you." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, resolved to see this through. But the question remained, would he be able to reach Richard in time, or would Rebecca's web tighten before he could act? Edward wasted no time. The next morning, he arrived at Turner Corporation determined to speak to Richard away from Rebecca's watchful eye. He knew that time was running short, and the tension in the air had only confirmed Margaret's warnings. Finding Richard alone in his office, Edward took a deep breath and closed the door behind him, ready to lay everything out. Richard looked up, surprised to see his uncle again so soon. "Uncle Edward, is everything all right?" he asked, a hint of concern in his voice. Edward didn't hesitate. "Richard, I didn't come all this way just for a friendly visit," he began, his tone steady but serious. "There are things you need to know. Things about Rebecca's influence on the company and the toll it's taking on your mother." Richard shifted uncomfortably, already defensive. "Uncle, I know my mother's concerns, but Rebecca's just making difficult decisions." "She's doing what's necessary," he replied, though his words lacked conviction. Edward pressed on, sensing a sliver of doubt beneath his nephew's guarded tone. "Richard, your mother feels abandoned," Edward continued, his voice softer now. "She believes that Rebecca's actions go beyond mere business decisions. The layoffs, the harsh policies, they're eroding everything your father worked to build, and you can't ignore that." Richard frowned, his hands clenching as he processed his uncle's words. He had noticed changes himself. The higher turnover, the growing resentment among employees, but he brushed it aside, trusting in Rebecca's assurances. Now, with Edward voicing his mother's fears, it was harder to dismiss the uncomfortable feeling that had been creeping up on him. As Richard sat in silence, Edward saw an opportunity to press further. "Your mother wrote to me, Richard," he said quietly, taking out Margaret's letter. "She's deeply afraid for you, for the company, and for herself. She's convinced that Rebecca's agenda is self-serving and that she's manipulating you to achieve her own goals." Richard read the letter, his face growing paler with each line. Margaret's words were raw, her worry painfully clear. He looked up, his eyes filled with confusion. "But how could I have missed this?" he whispered, the realization beginning to dawn on him. At that moment, the office door opened and Rebecca entered, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp as they darted between Edward and Richard. "Am I interrupting something?" she asked smoothly, her tone light, yet laced with suspicion. Edward slipped the letter back into his pocket, keeping his gaze steady. "Just a family discussion," he replied evenly, his demeanor unshaken. Rebecca's smile was strained, but she managed to keep her composure. "Well, I hope you're not troubling Richard with more of Margaret's concerns," she said, her voice sugar-coated but with an unmistakable edge. Richard, still processing everything he had just heard, glanced between his wife and his uncle. "Rebecca, my mother's concerns aren't something to dismiss," he said slowly, a newfound firmness in his voice. "We've made significant changes in the company, and people are starting to notice." Rebecca's face momentarily hardened before she forced a smile. "Richard, you know this is all part of making Turner Corporation stronger," she insisted, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes that requires difficult choices." Edward watched closely, sensing Rebecca's subtle attempt to regain control of the conversation. But at what cost, Rebecca? He interjected, his gaze piercing. I think we're all aware that these decisions have affected more than just the company's bottom line. Rebecca's hand tightened on Richard's shoulder, but she quickly released him, choosing to redirect her approach. Richard, she said softly, almost pleadingly, you know that everything I've done has been for you and your family. I would never do anything to jeopardize that. Caught between two conflicting voices, Richard felt the weight of his decisions bearing down on him. On one hand, he trusted his wife, the woman he had partnered with, who had helped him through many challenges. But on the other, he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that something was wrong. He turned to Edward, his face a mix of uncertainty and resolve. Uncle, if what you're saying is true, I need more than just suspicions, he said quietly. I need proof. Edward nodded, anticipating this request. I've already begun gathering information, he replied, his tone reassuring. There are employees, former staff members who have been dismissed under suspicious circumstances. Many of them are willing to talk, and their accounts align with what your mother suspects. Rebecca's smile faltered, but she quickly masked it, turning to Richard with an air of hurt innocence. You're not really listening to this, are you? She asked, her voice softening as she tried to appeal to his loyalty. Richard took a deep breath, conflicted but determined. Rebecca, he said, his tone gentle yet resolute, I think it's only fair that I look into this. If there's nothing to hide, then no harm will come of it. Rebecca's expression hardened momentarily, a flash of anger crossing her face before she regained her calm. Of course, she murmured, her voice barely masking her irritation. I have nothing to hide. Edward felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing he had planted the seeds of doubt within Richard's mind. He knew it would take time for Richard to fully confront the truth, but he felt certain that his nephew was finally beginning to question Rebecca's influence. As they finished their tense conversation, Edward could see a determination in Richard's eyes that hadn't been there before. But he also saw Rebecca's expression tighten, a hint of something dark lurking beneath her composed facade. That evening, back at his hotel, Edward received a call from one of the former employees he had contacted earlier. The man confirmed his suspicions, describing a pattern of dismissals and intimidation within the company. Rebecca has been pushing people out who didn't agree with her, the former employee said. She's ruthless. If Richard doesn't act soon, Turner Corporation will be unrecognizable. Edward thanked him, feeling the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The next morning, Edward met with Richard again, this time armed with more concrete information. Richard, I spoke to a few former employees, he said, laying out the details. They've all noticed the same pattern. Anyone who questions Rebecca's methods is removed. She's consolidating power, and it's clear she has an agenda. Richard's face darkened as he listened, the depth of Rebecca's actions starting to weigh heavily on him. This can't go on, he murmured, a mixture of anger and regret in his voice. But even as he spoke, Richard couldn't shake the fear of what confronting Rebecca would mean. She was his wife, his partner, and the person he had relied on for years. Would she stop at nothing to maintain her control? And if he didn't act soon, what would be left of Turner Corporation and of his relationship with his mother? As Edward continued to gather evidence and speak with Richard, Turner Corporation's decline became impossible to ignore. Longtime clients were withdrawing contracts, citing concerns about recent policy changes and the sudden turnover in staff. The once stable company, known for its loyalty and integrity, now had a tarnished reputation. Employees whispered in hallways, wondering how much longer they could hold on to their positions under Rebecca's ruthless management. The company that Margaret and her late husband had nurtured for decades was slipping away, bit by bit. Richard felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was torn between loyalty to his wife and his growing sense of responsibility to the company his parents had built. The evidence Edward had shown him, the testimonies of longtime employees and former staff members, gnawed at his conscience. For so long, he had wanted to believe that Rebecca's methods were simply necessary changes in a modern business. But now, He could no longer ignore the warning signs flashing around him. He had to confront Rebecca, but he wasn't sure how or when to do it without triggering her defenses. One afternoon, Richard received a call from an old family friend and business associate who expressed his disappointment over the recent layoffs and the company's shift in values. "This isn't the Turner Corporation your father built, Richard," the man said, his voice full of sadness. "Your father believed in people, in relationships. Now, it seems like it's all about profit." The call shook Richard to his core. Hearing these words from someone who had known his family for years drove home the reality of what was happening. He thanked the man, his heart heavy, and ended the call, feeling the full weight of his father's legacy pressing on his shoulders. The next day, Edward and Richard met again to discuss the situation. Richard was ready to take action, but still struggling with the thought of confronting his wife. Edward spoke with urgency. "Richard, we don't have time to hesitate. Rebecca is systematically tearing apart everything your family has built. If you don't intervene now, it may be too late." Richard nodded, his resolve finally hardening. He knew he couldn't let Rebecca's actions go unchecked any longer, but he still felt torn, haunted by memories of their early years together and the trust he had once placed in her. That evening, Richard returned home to find Rebecca waiting for him, her expression calm but watchful. Sensing his inner turmoil, she approached him with a warm smile. "You've been so distant lately, Richard. Is something on your mind?" Her tone was gentle, but Richard could see the flicker of calculation in her eyes. Taking a deep breath, he decided to bring up the company's issues cautiously, hoping to gauge her reaction. "Rebecca, I've been hearing concerns from clients and employees about the changes at Turner Corporation. Some feel that our direction is too aggressive." Rebecca's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, brushing off his concerns with a dismissive wave. "Richard, people are resistant to change, especially those who are used to outdated ways. Sometimes, we have to be firm to move forward." She spoke confidently, her voice laced with a hint of irritation, but Richard noticed a slight tension in her posture, the way her hand clenched slightly at her side. It was a small detail, but it confirmed what he had feared. She wasn't as confident in her position as she pretended to be. "I understand that change is necessary," Richard replied, keeping his tone steady. "But we're losing clients and employees who have been loyal for years. They don't recognize the company anymore." Rebecca's eyes narrowed, and a flash of anger crossed her face. "Richard, I'm doing what's best for the company," she said sharply, her voice tinged with frustration. "If you can't see that, maybe you're not cut out to make these kinds of decisions." Her words stung, and Richard felt his resolve waver momentarily. But he forced himself to remain calm, determined not to back down. After their tense conversation, Richard felt more isolated than ever. He began spending late nights at the office, reviewing financial reports and trying to understand the full extent of Rebecca's changes. The more he delved into the details, the more he realized just how extensive her influence had become. Departments were operating on skeleton crews. Key projects were falling behind, and morale was at an all-time low. Turner Corporation was teetering on the brink of collapse, and Richard could no longer ignore the devastating impact of his wife's decisions. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, Edward joined him, sensing his nephew's distress. "You're seeing the truth now, aren't you?" Edward asked gently, placing a reassuring hand on Richard's shoulder. Richard nodded, feeling the weight of his choices pressing down on him. "Yes, Uncle. I see it now. I just don't know how to stop it. Rebecca has taken control of so much, and if I confront her directly, I don't know what she'll do." Edward's gaze was steady. "Then we need to gather more evidence, enough to make it impossible for her to deny what she's done." "You're not alone in this, Richard." Over the next few days, Richard and Edward worked quietly to compile a case against Rebecca. They spoke with current and former employees, piecing together a timeline of her decisions and documenting the impacts on the company. Each testimony, each financial discrepancy they uncovered, painted a clearer picture of Rebecca's agenda. The company's struggles were no longer just growing pains or the cost of modernization. They were the result of a calculated, systematic dismantling of Turner Corporation's values and foundation. As Richard and Edward prepared to confront Rebecca with their findings, an uneasy anticipation settled over them. They knew that Rebecca would not back down easily and that her reaction could be unpredictable. But Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose, driven by the desire to restore his father's legacy and protect his mother's dreams for the family business. He was ready to face Rebecca, no matter the outcome. But he couldn't shake the feeling that she might have anticipated this move, and he wondered if she had a plan of her own waiting in the shadows. Late that night, Richard stood by the window, staring out into the city lights, his mind racing with thoughts of the upcoming confrontation. He knew that the path forward would be difficult, but he also knew that he couldn't continue down this road of blind trust. As he turned away from the window, he glanced at a framed photograph of his parents on his desk. Their smiles seemed to offer him strength, a reminder of the values they had instilled in him. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. But as he headed to bed, one question haunted him. Had Rebecca already anticipated his every move? The day Richard and Edward had been preparing for finally arrived. Armed with documents, testimonies, and undeniable evidence of Rebecca's harmful influence on Turner Corporation, they were ready to confront her. Richard's mind swirled with conflicting emotions. He knew that facing his wife like this would be no ordinary discussion. It would be a turning point for both his family and the company his parents had built with so much care. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, while Edward placed a firm, reassuring hand on his shoulder. Rebecca entered Richard's office with her usual confident demeanor, but her expression turned wary upon seeing Edward there as well. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes flickering with suspicion. Richard's face was calm, but his resolve was unmistakable. "Rebecca, we need to talk," he said, motioning for her to sit down. She hesitated, studying both men closely, but took a seat, crossing her legs with a practiced nonchalance. "Is this about those silly concerns again?" she asked dismissively, her tone bordering on condescension. Richard placed the documents on the desk in front of her, his voice steady. "This is more than just concerns. We have evidence that the choices you've made are not only damaging the company, but also betraying the values it was built on." Rebecca's gaze hardened as she scanned the papers, her posture stiffening. "You've been spying on me," she accused, looking up sharply, her eyes narrowing. "After everything I've done for this family, for you, this is how you repay me." She threw the papers back on the desk, her tone cold and cutting. Edward, who had been silent up to this point, stepped in. "Rebecca, this isn't about loyalty or betrayal. It's about the future of Turner Corporation and the harm your actions have caused. We've spoken with employees, reviewed financial records, and it's clear that you've crossed boundaries." Rebecca scoffed, her tone dripping with disdain. "Boundaries? Don't lecture me about boundaries, Edward. I did what needed to be done. The company was stagnant, weighed down by loyalty to employees who had outlived their usefulness." Richard felt his frustration build, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Rebecca, the people you dismissed were the heart of this company. They weren't just employees. They were family." His voice softened, a trace of the hurt he felt slipping through. "My parents believed in them, and so did I. This company wasn't built to be a machine for profit alone. It's a legacy, a community." But Rebecca shook her head, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Legacy? Community? Those are nothing more than sentiments, Richard. They don't keep a business profitable." The confrontation grew more intense as Rebecca defended her actions, her voice rising with each word. She accused Richard and Edward of clinging to outdated ideals, of lacking the foresight to see the company's potential. "I've made Turner Corporation more profitable than it's ever been," she argued, her voice sharp. "Do you really think your parents' values would have kept us relevant in today's market?" Richard's patience wore thin, and he leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. "At what cost, Rebecca? We're losing clients, our reputation, and our people. This isn't the company I want to lead." Rebecca's face twisted with contempt as she realized she was losing control. "You're weak, Richard," she spat, her voice cold and filled with disdain. "You and your family's sentimental nonsense have held this company back for years. I did what you didn't have the courage to do." She turned her gaze to Edward, her expression one of pure defiance. "And you, meddling in things you don't understand. You think you're the hero, swooping in to save the company? You're just as blind as Richard." Edward kept his composure, unfazed by her outburst. "Rebecca, if you truly believe that tearing down everything Turner Corporation stands for is the path forward, then maybe you're the one who doesn't understand this company or this family." Richard watched her reaction closely, searching for any sign of remorse or understanding. But all he saw was anger and disdain. He knew then that whatever bond they had once shared had been broken beyond repair. Rebecca had chosen her path, and it was one he could no longer follow. Realizing she was backed into a corner, Rebecca's tone shifted. "So, what now?" she sneered, leaning back in her chair, arms crossed. "Are you going to try to remove me from the company? I'm your wife, Richard. You can't just cast me aside." Richard hesitated, a pang of regret flickering in his eyes. But he knew he couldn't let her continue to tear down everything his family had built. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can't just cast you aside, but I also can't stand by while you destroy this company. We'll find a way to handle this legally and fairly. I won't stoop to your level." Rebecca's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a glimpse of desperation. She quickly regained her composure, a defiant smile appearing on her face. "Fine, Richard," she said, her voice chillingly calm. "If you want to play it that way, I'll make sure you regret this." With that, she stood up, straightening her blouse and gave him a final, steely glare. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," she added before turning on her heel and storming out of the office, leaving Richard and Edward in tense silence. As the door closed behind her, Richard let out a heavy sigh, slumping back into his chair. Edward placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "Standing up for what matters isn't easy, but it's necessary." Richard nodded, though his face was pale, his expression troubled. "It's not just about the company, Uncle," he admitted, his voice wavering. "It's about my family. I've lost my wife, and I fear I've let down my mother." Edward looked at him with a steady gaze, a mixture of empathy and resolve in his eyes. "Then let's focus on what's next," he replied. "You still have time to make things right. With the company, with your mother." Richard took a deep breath, the weight of the recent confrontation settling on his shoulders, but he felt a new sense of determination stirring within him. Turner Corporation could be saved, and his family's values could still be honored. But he knew that the road ahead would not be easy. After Rebecca's dramatic departure, Richard and Edward wasted no time preparing for the challenges they knew would come. They reached out to trusted colleagues and loyal employees, rallying support to rebuild the company's foundations and restore its values. The work was daunting, but for the first time, Richard felt a glimmer of hope. He was taking back control, stepping into the role his parents had envisioned for him. And while Rebecca's parting words haunted him, he knew that he was on the right path. As Richard left the office that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. He knew Rebecca well enough to understand that she would not go quietly. Her threat lingered in his mind, a chilling reminder that she was willing to go to great lengths to maintain her influence. But as he looked out over the city, he felt a newfound resolve. He was ready to face whatever came next, for his family, for Turner Corporation, and for the legacy his parents had entrusted to him. The aftermath of Rebecca's departure left Turner Corporation in a state of unrest. Rumors circulated among employees, and some doubted whether the company could ever recover from the turmoil of recent months. Richard felt the pressure intensify as he worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with the team, restoring the values that his family had established. He knew it was essential to act quickly, not just for the business, but for the people who had depended on Turner Corporation for decades. Richard spent hours meeting with department heads, listening to their concerns and explaining his plans to restore stability. The company's values of loyalty and integrity became his rallying points, and he spoke passionately about his parents' vision, hoping to re-inspire the workforce. Slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. Employees felt valued once more, and there was a renewed sense of purpose in the air. The most loyal staff members rallied around Richard, grateful for his commitment to undo the damage Rebecca had caused. But even as Richard was focused on rebuilding, he knew Rebecca wouldn't simply disappear. His suspicions were confirmed when he received an official letter from her lawyer, notifying him of her intent to sue for a significant portion of the company's assets. It was clear that Rebecca was determined to make him pay for standing against her. The letter demanded compensation that would severely impact Turner Corporation, leaving Richard with few options. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Torn between defending the company and dealing with Rebecca's wrath, determined not to let her destroy everything, Richard turned to Edward for guidance. Edward, having witnessed similar corporate battles in his own life, advised him to stand firm and fight back legally. "She'll use every trick she knows, Richard," Edward warned. "But you have the truth on your side and a company built on values. Don't let her threats scare you into submission." Richard nodded, grateful for his uncle's unwavering support. Together, they prepared a legal strategy to counter Rebecca's demands, gathering documentation of her manipulative tactics and the damages she'd caused to Turner Corp. While preparing his defense, Richard took one more step to secure the company's future. He reached out to several key clients and business partners, openly addressing the changes Turner Corporation had undergone and the values he was committed to restoring. This transparency struck a chord with many clients who had felt uneasy about the company's recent direction. Several expressed relief and pledged to continue their partnerships, inspired by Richard's honesty and dedication. It was a crucial win, and for the first time in months, Richard felt a renewed sense of confidence. The legal battle with Rebecca soon became a drawn-out war, marked by tense court appearances and endless rounds of negotiations. Rebecca's demands were outrageous, but her legal team was relentless, twisting facts and painting her as the victim of Richard's ungratefulness. She portrayed herself as the one who had sacrificed for the company's survival, even as the evidence of her harmful actions grew clearer. Richard watched her, realizing just how deeply she was willing to deceive and manipulate to achieve her goals. Outside the courtroom, the strain of the battle began to take its toll on Richard. Nights became sleepless as he reviewed documents, met with lawyers, and prepared for each confrontation. But Edward remained by his side, a steady presence in the storm. "Remember why you're doing this, Richard," he would remind him in moments of doubt. "It's not just about winning. It's about honoring your parents and protecting everything they built." Those words kept Richard focused, and he drew strength from his family's legacy, determined not to let Rebecca rewrite their history. As the case progressed, Richard began to feel the support of the people who mattered most. Loyal employees, clients, and even former partners voiced their backing, some even offering testimony that painted a clear picture of Rebecca's actions. In the face of overwhelming evidence, the tide began to turn. Rebecca's legal team faltered, and cracks began to show in her case. Frustration bubbled beneath her calm exterior as she realized her control was slipping, and her once unbreakable confidence began to wane. Rebecca's final attempt came in a desperate move to sell the case out of court, demanding a substantial sum in exchange for withdrawing her claims. Richard knew the offer was a last-ditch effort to salvage something from her failed attempt at domination. He met with Edward to discuss the terms, but both agreed that any settlement would be a compromise of their values. "Let her fight," Edward said firmly. "The truth is on our side. We don't need to give in to her demands." Richard agreed, refusing to let Rebecca profit from her deceitful tactics. On the final day in court, Rebecca's case collapsed. Her legal team, overwhelmed by the weight of the evidence against her, struggled to defend her actions. One by one, the witnesses and documents Richard had gathered painted an undeniable picture of her manipulation and greed. Rebecca sat silently, her face pale, as the judge ruled against her claims, effectively ending her control over Turner Corporation. Richard felt a mixture of relief and sadness as he watched her leave the courtroom, realizing that the woman he had once loved was now a stranger. With the legal battle behind him, Richard returned to Turner Corporation with a renewed sense of purpose. The employees who had stood by him greeted him with applause, and he felt a surge of gratitude for their loyalty. In a speech to his staff, he promised to uphold the values his family had instilled in the company, vowing to rebuild Turner Corporation on the foundation of integrity and respect. The company was scarred by Rebecca's actions, but it was still standing, ready to rise again. In the quiet of his office that evening, Richard sat alone, reflecting on the long and painful journey he had endured. He thought of his parents and of Margaret, who had seen the danger long before he had. He was grateful for her courage and for Edward's unwavering support. As he looked out over the city, he knew that Turner Corporation would need time to fully recover, but he felt a deep conviction that the company would thrive once more. But even as he savored the victory, Richard couldn't shake the lingering feeling of what had been lost. The betrayal he had experienced from Rebecca left a scar that would take time to heal. Yet he also felt a newfound strength, a commitment to protect his family's legacy against any future threats. He had faced the storm and emerged stronger, and Turner Corporation was ready to begin a new chapter, one that would be written with integrity and resilience. With the legal battle finally behind him, Richard dedicated himself fully to restoring Turner Corporation. He spent countless hours with the employees, re-establishing connections that had been strained under Rebecca's rule. Richard knew that trust had to be rebuilt step by step. He openly acknowledged the difficulties they had endured and promised a future based on respect, loyalty, and integrity. His commitment to transparency brought a renewed sense of purpose to the team, and the once muted energy of the office began to return. Richard also focused on repairing relationships with clients and partners. He personally reached out to each of them, sharing his vision for the company's future and assuring them of Turner Corporation's return to its roots. Many were moved by his sincerity and determination. Gradually, those who had distanced themselves under Rebecca's leadership began to renew their partnerships. Feeling confident in Richard's direction, Turner Corporation was healing, and its community of supporters was growing stronger than ever. Amid the rebuilding efforts, Richard's relationship with his mother, Margaret, became a priority. He visited her frequently, sharing updates on the company and seeking her guidance. Their conversations were filled with honesty, Margaret offering her wisdom and encouragement as Richard took on the responsibility of leading Turner Corporation. Margaret's relief was evident, and with each visit, Richard saw her health and spirit improve. Her faith in him fueled his dedication, reminding him why he was fighting to preserve the legacy she and his father had built. As the company stabilized, Edward continued to play an active role as a mentor and advisor, standing by Richard's side in every step of the rebuilding process. He provided insights into the industry and shared strategies from his own experiences, becoming a valuable pillar of support. Richard couldn't have made it through the ordeal without Edward's steadfast guidance. Together, they formed a formidable team, ensuring that Turner Corporation would emerge not just intact, but even stronger. Despite the positive momentum, Richard occasionally felt the weight of the betrayal he had experienced. Rebecca's actions had left deep scars, and he was still coming to terms with the person she had turned out to be. Yet, rather than letting it consume him, he used it as a lesson. He had learned to be vigilant, to trust his instincts, and to never let anyone compromise the values that defined Turner Corporation. The experience had changed him, molding him into a leader who understood the importance of integrity above all else. Months passed, and Turner Corporation began to thrive again, stronger and more resilient than ever. Richard introduced new initiatives to honor his parents' legacy, including a scholarship program for employees' families and partnerships with local charities. His goal was to reinvest in the community that had supported Turner Corporation for so long. These gestures were warmly received, deepening the bond between the company and the people who valued its presence. The company's reputation, once tarnished, began to shine with new brilliance. One morning, as Richard prepared for an annual company gathering, He felt a sense of pride and accomplishment he hadn't known in years. He stood before the assembled employees, sharing his gratitude and vision for the future. "We've faced challenges, but we've come through stronger," he said, his voice steady with conviction. Turner Corporation has always been more than just a business. It's a family, and together, we will carry on this legacy. Applause filled the room, and for the first time in a long time, Richard felt at peace. As he returned to his office, Edward joined him, both of them taking a moment to reflect on the journey. Edward's eyes shone with pride, and he placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "You've done something remarkable here, Richard. Your parents would be proud." Richard smiled, a hint of relief in his expression. "I couldn't have done it without you, Uncle. Thank you for everything." They shared a quiet moment, knowing that the battles they had faced had been worth every sacrifice. With the sun setting over the city, Richard looked out over the skyline, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Turner Corporation was back on track, a symbol of resilience and integrity in an industry often driven by ruthless ambition. The trials he had endured had taught him valuable lessons, shaping him into a leader who would safeguard the company's values for generations to come. And though Rebecca's actions had tested him in ways he never expected, he emerged stronger, wiser, and more dedicated to his family's legacy. The chapter had closed on one of the most challenging periods of his life, and a new dawn had begun. As he looked toward the future, Richard felt a profound gratitude for those who had stood by him, especially Edward and Margaret. Together, they had preserved Turner Corporation as heart and soul, ensuring it would thrive for years to come. And with a determined smile, he knew he was ready to face whatever lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that he was honoring the legacy of the family that had come before him. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.